born rebel. When Theodore Hall graduated high school at the age of 13, he listed his top three career options: comedian, journalist, physicist. At just 14, Hall entered Queens College in New York City. Finding the work too easy, he transferred to Harvard and loaded up on the toughest math and physics courses available. The challenging subjects were delightful and hot stuff, he told his brother. Physicist jumped to the top of his job list. Ted Hall turned 18 in 1944. He was about 6 feet tall and very thin with wavy black hair. He was about to finish college and assumed he'd be drafted into the Army as soon as he graduated. The government had other plans. One afternoon, Hall was asked to report to a meeting room in the physics lab building on campus. When he walked in, he saw that the shades were drawn, the lights dim. There was a long table in the room, but only one man sat at the table. He introduced himself as a physics professor who now worked for the government in Washington, D.C. "There is a project," the man told Hall. "It's doing quite important work, and they need some more hands." Hall asked for a bit more detail. The man shook his head, saying only that the project was war-related and top secret. After the meeting, Hall walked back to his dorm. He talked with a friend from down the hall, a fellow physics student who had also been recruited by the mysterious man from Washington. They took turns guessing what they were being asked to do and where they'd go to do it. Hall's roommate, Seville Sachs, listened to the whole conversation. Sachs was a dedicated communist, and he knew Hall had shown interest in communism as well. "If it turns out to be a weapon, that is really awful," Sachs said. "What you should do about it is tell the Russians." Hall glared at Sachs. Sachs said nothing more. Hall rode the train to New Mexico and found his way to 109 East Palace Avenue in Santa Fe. He walked through a courtyard, knocked on a door, and entered a small office. There at a desk sat a smiling Dorothy McKibben. She made an ID badge for Hall and a quick phone call. A car came, and Hall was driven to the top of a nearby mesa and through the gates of Los Alamos. At a brief orientation, Hall was told he'd be helping to build an atomic bomb. He was given a secret little book known as the Los Alamos Primer, made up of copies of the lectures Robert Serber had given the year before. He got a white ID badge, giving him unrestricted access to the tech area. After spending a few days studying atomic bomb physics, Hall went to work with a team led by the Italian-born physicist Bruno Rossi. The team was given a tiny amount of pure U-235, one of the first samples to arrive from the Oak Ridge plant. Rossi asked Hall to carefully place the thin uranium strip inside a specially built machine that would bombard the uranium with neutrons. The more senior scientists watched while Hall worked the uranium into place. If he dropped the sample and contaminated it, they'd have to wait weeks for more 235. "It wasn't the easiest gadget to work with," Hall later said. "As I mounted the specimen, I remembered my hands were shaking. I don't know whether they were shaking enough for anyone else to see." Hall got the sample in place, and Rossi's machine bombarded it with neutrons. They figured out how many of the neutrons hit uranium atoms and caused fission. This was part of the process of determining exactly how much U-235 would be needed to make a uranium bomb. Impressed with his youngest team member, Rossi recommended Hall for even more important work, and in the summer of 1944, Oppenheimer needed all the help he can get. The crisis began that spring, remembered the mathematician Stanislaw Ulam. Ulam was working in his office when he heard footsteps and turned toward his open door. "I saw Robert Oppenheimer running excitedly down a corridor holding a small vial in his hand," Ulam said. Doors opened, people were summoned, whispered conversations ensued. There was great excitement. Ulam ran into the hall and was told that Oppenheimer was holding the first samples of plutonium to arrive at Los Alamos. It was just a few grams, but it was enough to start some important experiments. The plan for the uranium bomb was to fire one lump of uranium at another inside a gun barrel. Oppenheimer scientists assumed that the same gun assembly method would work for plutonium, but experiments proved them wrong. Fission occurred even faster than expected in plutonium, causing a chain reaction to begin more quickly than in uranium. So in a gun assembly bomb, the chain reaction would start even before the two lumps of plutonium came completely together. Enough energy would be released to blow the plutonium apart, but only with as much force as a normal bomb. The critical mass of plutonium would not stay together long enough to create a massive atomic explosion. The terrible shock, an inescapable one, was that the gun assembly method could not be used for the plutonium, John Manley remembered. A gun just would not assemble plutonium fast enough. What made this such a serious crisis was that Oak Ridge might be able to produce enough U-235 for one atomic bomb by the middle of 1945. If Oppenheimer was going to make more than one bomb, and Groves was demanding that he do so, the bombs would have to be made with plutonium, which was easier to produce than U-235. The bottom line, Oppenheimer now had to figure out a whole new design for an atomic bomb. The timing only added to the pressure. Allied forces landed in France in June 1944 and began battling east across French territory towards Germany. The Allies were finally winning the war, but Hitler could still turn it around by winning the race for the atomic bomb. The only way we could lose the war, said physicist Philip Morrison, was if we failed in our jobs. Still 18, Ted Hall was the youngest scientist at Los Alamos. By summer, he'd learned the basics of the uranium bomb. Then Bruno Rossi put him to work experimenting with components of the new plutonium bomb. The challenge of the top-secret work was thrilling. Living conditions are still poor here and will remain so, Hall wrote to his family. But I would be willing to live on whale blubber alone in an igloo at the South Pole for a crack at the same job. Hall felt relaxed enough at Los Alamos to be himself, which meant doing things his own way. Once late at night, a fellow physicist came into Hall's office to look for some papers. He saw a 10-foot-high stack of crates in the middle of the room. On top of the leaning tower sat Hall, cross-legged, lost in thought. He was interested in tweaking the system, said one scientist. He was a natural-born rebel. On Sundays, Hall sometimes went on hikes or played a little ping pong. But he spent most of his time off lying in bed in his tiny room listening to classical music and thinking, and not about science. Here's general sympathy for our allies, the Soviet Union, Hall explained. After they were attacked, everybody knew that they were bearing the main load in the fight against Nazi Germany. It looked like the Germans would be defeated, but what then? Hall tried to imagine what the post-war world would be like. I shared a common belief that the horrors of war would bring our various leaders to their senses and usher in a period of peace and harmony, Hall said. But what if this didn't happen? What if the Americans succeeded in building atomic bombs and they were the only ones to have them? Would the United States be more likely to use atomic bombs knowing no one else could strike back? Wouldn't the world be safer if a second major power also knew how to build atomic bombs? That way neither country would use the bomb, knowing they'd have the bomb used on them. It seemed to me, Hall said, that an American monopoly was dangerous and should be prevented. Looking back at his younger self, Hall would later call himself a rather arrogant teenager. That helps explain why he decided to change the course of history. My decision about contacting the Soviets was a gradual one, he said, and it was entirely my own.